seen a vast swing in appraisals, and sometimes I'm surprised we haven't gotten a couple questions off that over our life on the podcast here.
Well, and I think we will start to see more of those because it's becoming a bigger issue. It sort of became a non-issue for a while because things were going through a fairly steady, decline in inventory, and I think it's going to become a bigger issue as things tighten up more because it's going to put more upward pressure on pricing, especially with low interest rates. You got to remember, every 1% change in interest rate equates to a 10% bigger buying power. In other words, if you could afford a house that was $100,000, hypothetically, and rates dropped by a point, and they've gone down way more than a point from where they were a while ago, you can afford 10% higher house for $110,000. And obviously, at each successive $100,000 price point, certainly in Austin, $200,000 means $220,000. So now, let's say rates went down by more than 2 points, which they have. Now you're talking a buyer that originally may have topped out at $200,000 that is closer to $250,000 now, $240,000, $250,000. That's why we're seeing a bigger portion of our market with lower inventory than you would normally expect. It's the low rates that are bringing people in. It is tempered by what you said, where you've got a challenge where there's an even bigger pool of buyers behind them that Dodd-Frank and the lending incentives are keeping out of the market because they just can't qualify now. This is going to require more people to go through credit repair. It's going to require more people to save more money before they purchase because they're going to need a more significant down payment. So let's get into that part two of the news now, Perry. Austin Real Estate News Roundup for existing home sales. This is a national number and the inventory. This is an economist by the name of Lawler. And when you look at this article that came out based on the national numbers, there's an interesting shift happening nationwide. This does not affect Austin like it does the markets. And it doesn't affect a lot of markets in Texas the way it does other parts of the country. And for a long time, people were afraid of shadow inventory. A lot of time, people were afraid of, oh my God, what happens when the banks dump all this inventory on? Well, they're not. I have my suspicions that the government is having a big influence in this. If you think about the fact that the government took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government has got a stranglehold over the banking industry. So there's no incentive for them to dump inventory on the market. And what they have done is they put the gas pedal down to the floor on short sales. Nobody has talked about what happens on December 31st with short sales. And the difference, obviously, and I'll just do this real quick because there may be people listening that are like, well, I don't understand short sale foreclosure. Short sales where you negotiate with your lender or lenders to get them to allow you to sell through a normal transaction, meaning you get a third-party buyer and your bank agrees to take less than what they're owed. So right now, what this economist has talked about is they're analyzing short sales versus foreclosures first, and there was a complete shift. And in quite a few markets, including places like Arizona that were just awash with foreclosures, they now have 3 and 4 times as many short sales that are being completed as they have foreclosures, which I find to be very interesting, don't you?
Absolutely, we do. It seems like they're running out.
Yeah, well, I don't know that so much they're running out. I just think there's less inventory of them, but also, if you think about the buying pool, many of the large blocks of foreclosures get bought by investors and wholesalers, and they require work. Many of short sale homes you could move into, you don't have to do the work. In other words, not only is the incentive working, but the homes that are typically offered, and personally in my production practice, I've done over 500 closed short sales. And wow. The vast majority of them were occupied by the buyer. Day one when they closed. Very few were purchased by investors. That is not the case if you go through and look at foreclosures. You've been through a few of them here in Austin, and they need anywhere from a little bit of work to they're basically uninhabitable until they get completely redone, don't they?
Yeah, and the current market, another example of how the Dodd-Frank rules work is you've got to have the cash to do that work because it's very unlikely that you'll get a loan to fix it up.
That's absolutely correct, Perry. And then, so what's interesting is the second point that was made in this article is the percentage of distressed sales, where you add the number of foreclosures plus short sales, is down year over year in almost every market in the country. So there was a concern for a while that investors were goosing the market, meaning the percentage of investors that were buying things were actually providing more sales than were sustainable long term. just because there were so many foreclosures they were buying, and that's dropped dramatically. So it's sort of changed from something now. Now, what I was alluding to before, and I want to tie this down, is there's a federal mandate that says you can do a short sale. And let's say you owe $200,000 in a house that's worth $175,000. The bank agrees to take it, and your $25,000, the difference between those two numbers, is forgiven by your lender. As of December 31st, the way things exist today, as of the recording of this podcast, that expires, where you're no longer having debt forgiveness without a tax consequence. The federal government has had this on the books for several years, and what happens is this gets added to your income like a 1099 tax bill, like you earned the $25,000 and you got to pay taxes on it. So the wild card on what happens with all this. Now we got all these short sales, and the real question here, and the reason I bring this up is people are wondering if all these short sales are being pushed now in a mad dash to try and get them done by December 31st, because I can tell you I have no idea whether the federal government is going to extend this or not. Do you have any suspicion? You want to take a bet on this?
I'm not taking a bet on that one.
I'm given the financial cliff and everything else that's coming up on December 31st, I don't know that they're going to allow anything that cuts away from potential revenue to close any gap anywhere.
Right.
I think their attitude is going to be that it's been long enough, it's been several years, and if you wanted to do a short sale, you should have done it over the last 3 or 4 years. That's my position. I don't think it will get extended. So it'll be interesting. I'm not a betting guy either. But let's go to the last article, our second part of the news. CNBC had an article, Is There a Housing Shortage? And this article on CNBC, they go through a pretty large discussion about investor market share in the foreclosure short sale driven markets. We touched on that a little bit. And what's interesting is this kind of ties to everything we've been talking about. Sellers are holding back putting houses on the market. And there's like, in Austin, I'll tie this down for Austin, but this is happening all across the country. There are 2 drivers for this. One is, if you're a seller, can you actually get financing? Does the loan program exist compared to when you purchased? If you were to sell now and you want to repurchase, would you be able to go get and purchase another home? And for some sellers, the answer is no. The second thing is sellers are holding back just because of a confidence level. And then third, we talked about is inventory. Some people are looking in the market and saying, God, if I sell this house, I know it's not perfect for the family, but if I were to sell this, could I, in fact, purchase something? Is there enough inventory on the market? At some point, the low inventory, like we talked about in part 1 of the news, will inhibit people from selling. You hit that point where they're like, unless you're leaving Austin, and you think about this for Austin, I'm going to get very, very local now, Austin MSA. Right. If we have more people coming in, a hyper-tight rental market, and very few people leaving, that means the majority of the sellers who are selling are going to do what? They're going to purchase again.
That's right.
And if we have no inventory, and this will tie back to my comment about what happens when you hit the ceiling on sales volume. The ceiling on sales volume is going to come when those sellers are holding back and putting their houses on the market because they have nowhere to go. They go out and look, and they, for example, want to buy in Belterra out by Dripping Springs. And they go in there and they look, and there's 25% of the homes available that were available 3 or 4 years ago. They can't find anything they're interested in. They hold off for a month. They go back and look again. There's still no houses on the market because what happens is it's sort of like a chicken and egg challenge. The house that does come on the market goes under contract, the first weekend, the first week or two? And
depending on the area.
It becomes a challenge. So what you have is you have incoming buyers who can purchase. Let's say they've already purchased their home or sold their home in another market. They're moving in. They're able to purchase right away. And it almost becomes a disadvantage for sellers unless they're ready to go very quickly and they'll open up their options for what they're willing to take when they purchase. So I think we're going to see, as we talked about, and this ties down to part 1 of what we did in the news today, less sellers wanting to go on the market, which is going to provide more of a challenge for us with inventory coming into the spring market. Now, there'll be a lot of houses that always go on the market. If you talk about listings that expire every year, the normal mode is kids go back into school, they pull them off, you talk to them, and they say, I'm going to try it again in the spring. Those will be out there, and I kind of call that the noise inventory. It was so far overpriced that it didn't sell in a market like we have. And even with our conditions, unless prices move up to the point where they catches up with those persons that previously tried to sell and expired. And so let's say, for example, you wanted $200,000 for your house, and everything else in your neighborhood was selling for $180,000, $185,000. You were out of the market. You were above the prices at which it would sell. It certainly wouldn't appraise for that. Now the question is, how long does it take for that gap to close between what things were selling for and what they want? Some of those houses that were previously expired will come on the market and will fill some of this gap. But if you looked at for every 100, it's not going to be the majority of them. It's typically probably 15 or 20%. So that doesn't fill our gap. And then the last thing they talk about in this article, Perry, is loan modifications on programs are increasing. You see Bank of America, you see Wells Fargo, and this isn't a big factor in Texas or in Austin, but nationwide, there are a lot of people that are getting loan modifications. And what this is doing, and it's hurting inventory nationwide, it is causing people to be able to stay in their houses. And they're forgiving principal, something that was like the holy grail that no lender ever would do. And now big lenders like Bank of America are doing this at a massive scale. And so that will keep more people in their existing houses and and this is more of a national issue, put more of a ceiling on sales nationally. So it's going to be interesting times, especially here in Texas and in Austin. We've got the strong job growth market, we've got a strong economy, and we've got low inventory. And as we always talk about, builders putting new construction on the ground are a big part of the engine. I think you'll see more people get pushed into new construction that may not have considered it before because it becomes a viable option. In a hot market like this, most big national builders realize that they can front-end the market for people that will purchase that want to take delivery next July in contracts that they can take now. They've already got the house sold. They'll do it on a contingent basis because they know, especially if it's listed with a good agent, that they can, in fact, count on that house selling. Now, they're going to look at whether people want to price it right and what they're willing to accept, and they'll put that into the terms. I think, Perry, as we wrap up on this, would you agree that that's not going to happen more? People will have to consider, as Austin sellers, new construction more frequently.
I think so, especially, I think people want new construction in general, too. I mean, there's lots of projects running around here that are starting to ramp up because of that, too.
Well, it's ramping up, but as we talked about, it takes longer for it to kick in. So